Hello and welcome to AIB headquarters here in Dublin. I'm Laura Heuston, co-founder of SustainabilityWorks, and I'm very happy to be with you as we come close to the end of day 3 of the 5th annual Climate Finance Week. This is all organised by, of course, Sustainable Finance Ireland in association with the Department of Finance. And we're here in the very impressive surroundings of AIB headquarters on Molesworth Street. This event has been facilitated by Offshore Wind and Temporis Capital, who are sponsors of Climate Finance Week. And we've got an excellent panel for you over the next hour or so to discuss the topic of accelerating the net zero transition, the role of private equity and the state in delivering upon Ireland's sustainability and energy security ambitions. So, ambitious climate targets have been set. As we all know, the aim is a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 51% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. On top of that, the energy crisis is focusing efforts on accelerating that already ambitious timeline to reduce Ireland's reliance on fossil fuels. And from an electricity generation perspective, we're aiming for 80% renewables on our grid by 2030. And the estimate of the investment required across generation and grid is 36 billion, and I have no doubt that number will increase over time. So a lot of uncertainty around how we are going to get there, but the one thing we can be sure of is that neither the state alone nor the private sector alone can deliver on what we need to do, not in terms of capital nor resources. So collaboration is imperative across public and private, across industry and finance, between business and the communities. But where should the finance be directed? What are the hot topics of collaboration, and what are the main challenges that need to be overcome if we are to advance effectively on our shared ambitions? Our expert panel will address those questions and more, and we're going to focus on the positive, constructive and creative solutions that are required to deliver on what we need to do. And we have a great range of contributors here today from across the sector. So we have Paul Saunders, Head of Climate and Senior Investment Director with Ireland Strategic Investment Fund. We have Vanessa O'Connell, Head of Offshore Wind. We have Mark Griffin, Chief Executive of EirGrid. And Patrick Mohr, Mark Foley, Chief Executive of EirGrid. And Patrick Mohr, Associate Investment Director with Temporis Capital. And then we've David O'Donnell, co-founder of Greensource, an Irish renewable energy development company. So very welcome to all of you, and thanks for being here. And Vanessa, I'm going to start with you. You're out there developing offshore wind projects around our coasts. You're there day to day, and you're really seeing what's needed from a collaboration perspective between public and private. Can you give us some insights on your experience engaging with stakeholders at all levels?
So just to, reflecting on that in terms of the personal journey and the journey of Offshore Wind over the last year or so, and the hundreds of engagements that we're having all across the landscape in terms of Irish society, from all the way from the local level to the government level. So thinking about collaboration and one of the challenges that we're currently facing, it's we're looking to secure the permits that we need from government to go out and survey the seabed, which is a critical first step in developing offshore wind. You need to understand the ground conditions and the ability for your project to be able to be built. So, we've got the capital and we're willing to make the investment, but we need the permit from the foreshore unit to go ahead. So, while from the outside, it's really frustrating. We want to get the permit and it's taking some time. We also have to be cognizant of the fact that the foreshore unit, was never intended to regulate the maritime area in the way it's been expected to do so currently. On top of this, the team is small and they're having to deal with an avalanche of projects coming through the system. So I think we need to be patient as an industry to recognise the time it takes to resource and put the frameworks and the proper system in place to process the applications. And at the same time, the government needs to recognise the challenges we face, which currently is uncertainty, which really is risking the capital that we need to put in place to support the transition to net zero. And to focus on one of the bright spots that I've seen and sort of hope for this collaboration piece, it's the Offshore Wind Delivery Task Force, which is established by government back in April in the response to the energy security crisis. So this is a cross-departmental government sort of organisation. It includes DEC, Department of Transport, EirGrid, lots of government organisations that are responsible for delivering offshore wind, and they're currently working away to develop a plan for delivery. I think probably one of the things that I would love to see going forward is widening out the group, bringing the industry to the table alongside other relevant bodies who have an interest in how offshore wind is developed. I'm talking about environmental NGOs, I'm talking about community representatives, as there's many people in the industry and beyond who are really passionate about doing what's right for Ireland from an energy perspective. And I do think that's one of the beauties of Ireland. We are a small country. So I would hope, in Ireland, we can get to the same table relatively easy.
Yeah, brilliant. So you can see really there, like, that collaboration is happening, but there are obviously challenges. There are places where it can be approved, but certainly you're giving great examples there, collaboration, but within the public sector and then kind of between public and private. I might go to you, David, next. So you're a renewable energy developer. You've built a wind project on your own land, and you're obviously involved in, getting planning permission and grid applications for other projects in the areas that you work. Can you give us any examples that you have of where you've seen kind of good examples of collaboration between public and private sectors around renewables?
Sure, Laura, thanks very much. I guess just by way of background, as you said, we've kind of started from the ground up really here, in that I started out life in agriculture from a family farm business. And then over 20 years ago in the late 90s would have looked at, well, what other industries could we get into, could we diversify into, and I guess different facets of renewable energy, not just onshore wind, but also waste to energy in the form of anaerobic digestion biogas. And we went on to build those on our own land, as you said, and I guess the collaboration piece of that has been huge for us in terms of, first of all, great support from AIB as a customer of theirs for many years. Then obviously on the private equity side, more recently, I suppose we've grown from a business of one employee about 15 years ago to about 25 today, and that's all from kind of organic indigenous growth. And in more recent times, that's been very heavily supported through the Aurora Fund from Temporis. Without that, we wouldn't have been able to reach the levels of ambition, I guess, that we wanted to reach. And again, to use the skills that have been grown in our small group. We're based in Adair in Limerick, and we've grown from that throughout the west of Ireland, so we have projects up as far as Donegal, down to Waterford. And that's really, that support is needed, because if we had to do that through our own revenues or our own equity, we just couldn't have done that in the space of time that we've done it. So I think that's one piece. I think the second piece is that certainly in rural Ireland, that from the point of view of engaging other stakeholders, the landowners that are often sort of forgotten about, I guess, a little bit, but the wind does blow over their land from an onshore wind perspective. And obviously we've commercial arrangements with them, but we've tried certainly in recent years to involve them more in the project. And it's not a case of once you sign up to do a development with us, that's the end of it. It's really more about bringing their community with us as well. And I think from a community engagement point of view, we've learned to listen a lot more to the needs of individual communities, because they can be quite different and quite diverse. And I think we've learned over the years of what works and what doesn't. And what we're certainly seeing in the last short while is a lot more people, I suppose, willing to engage, given the security of supply issues that are very much to the fore now. I think that has caused pause for thought for a lot of people to kind of say, well, hang on a minute, maybe we should think about this in our backyard. So it's not the default is not no anymore. Now, there's still a small number of people obviously would prefer if we did things elsewhere, but I think a growing number who are more accepting of that. But I think, again, the partnership of having the funding model correct to support that then when we need it allows us to get on with that business. And that's really where I suppose we can excel.
And I'm going to go to Mark Foley next from EirGrid, but just from your perspective, I know that there was an example that you gave of, an approach that EirGrid is adopting in relation to engaging with developers. Can you talk to us about that?
Absolutely. I was saving the compliments for Mark for later, but we'll get straight into them. So in terms of the, I suppose, the customer engagement model that's there, so us as a developer, we can engage with EirGrid at an early stage in a project and have a clinic where effectively we can look at a proposed project, look at the options for grid connection. And we have some very qualified, skilled people from Mark's company kind of assess that with us and help us to inform us as to how we're going to go about realising this project. And I suppose we'd just like to thank Mark for that, and encourage more of it in the future would be great.
So giving you that certainty as you go forward as to how this project is going to evolve.
Absolutely.
So Mark, obviously a really busy time for EirGrid, and thanks so much for taking the time to come in here for this. Particularly as we head into the winter now and all the challenges that are facing us as a country. I suppose looking forward, looking in terms of what we need to do from a renewable energy generation and grid perspective, collaboration is going to be a key part of that. How is your model of collaboration in EirGrid evolving?
Yeah, I like to look at this using the old sporting metaphor. We're at half-time in the game. Look at what we achieved up to 2020. 40% of all of our electricity coming from renewable sources. The development from nothing of an extraordinary ecosystem around onshore wind. The right policy framework coming out of government. Much as people complain about the planning system, 4,500 megawatts of wind got consented and got built. Good tariffs, feed-in tariffs, see the right economic investment signals, private capital, public capital, private developers, semi-state developers, and I think EirGrid paying its part in terms of knitting it all together. And that only worked because all of those different elements of the jigsaw, were all working in synergy, and we achieved extraordinary things at the halfway mark. The other thing that which we don't speak as much about, is a lot of developers really did excel in community engagement. You would think in some of the narrative that we never built a wind farm or that all the communities are up in arms. There's a good success story behind it. Now let's look at the second half, which is to get us to 2030. The challenge is simply staggering by comparison. We've got to do in 10 years what was more than what was done in the previous 15 to 18 years. So the level of engagement and cross-functionality, transparency, has to reach a new level. I mean, really to a new level, if we're going to have any chance of achieving what are extraordinarily difficult targets. We'll eventually get there. The question is, can we get there in time? Government policy is in reasonable shape, in fairness. We have the Climate Action Plan. The planning system is problematic, there's no question about it. And the maritime legislation for offshore wind is less than a year old and is yet to be tested. So there could be challenges in front of us. But we've got to get that offshore wind. It only works. 2030 dream only works if you have a significant amount of offshore wind. Yes, we need more onshore wind, and yes, we need solar. But we need that complementarity of the three technology. You need all the bits of the jigsaw. You take one out and it isn't going to work. So that means even more engagement, more collaboration, more optimization needs to take place. We've got to build a grid. We've got to build the interconnection. So those, most of the elements are there. The technology is proven and the capital is there. It's all about deliverability. It's about delivery.
About action now.
The regulatory overhang is critical. There's problems with it. You know, we have to be honest about that. We've shortages of conventional capacity to backstop renewables, and we need to move faster in terms of future system services so we can get the services on the system so we can drive the SNSP up, so that developers have greater certainty in terms of planning and funding their projects. So there are things to be fixed there, frankly, but the engagement, and that's only fixed by getting all the parties in a room and starting to talk about what's the optimum solution and what's deliverable. The third leg of the stool is the people, the communities, the hearts and minds bit. Without that, we're in really big trouble. We did something no other state company had done earlier this year with Shaping Electricity Future, which we went far and wide, right around the country to every aspect of society, business. And we said to people, what do you think we should do in order to achieve this transformation, which is bigger than rural electrification? And we got an extraordinary response, an extraordinary, people took time out, people engaged in consultation processes from youth assemblies to local parishes right around the country. And we got a very clear message. People want to be engaged with, not just at the beginning of a project, right through the lifetime, and people want to be part of the system. We never dreamt when we looked at this proposition the extent to which people say they want to be involved, particularly in terms of solar on their homes. So the pathway, which is articulated in Shaping Electricity Future, demonstrates how we listened to people and how we've incorporated their views in that future pathway. So I think we're talking about a decade of transparency and collaboration like we've never seen before. I think it beholds everybody, and we have to give example on this, opening our doors, opening our books, showing people what we're doing, and being demonstrably transparent.
And I think one of the initiatives that you mentioned was transparency over the capital programme, over what is coming next, which is a brilliant thing to be introduced. Paul, I might come to you next. So as Head of Climate in the Ireland Strategic Investment Fund and a cornerstone investor in Temporis Aurora, what role does the ISIF have to play in Ireland meeting climate targets and sustainability targets?
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Laura. So we think an important role. As you know, ISIF is the €9 billion sovereign development fund in Ireland, and we have a dual bottom line mandate to invest for commercial return and economic impact. When it comes to climate, we essentially take investments that help progress towards the 2030 targets or towards net zero as a proxy for economic impact. So that's very much our focus, but all investments have to be on a commercial basis. Climate's a core theme for us. We have about €500 million committed to climate investments to date.
Yep.
Approximately 285 million of that has been done since last September, when we announced our ambition to invest $1 billion in climate-related investments over the next number of years. We're, I think, a fairly unique beast in the sort of the Irish investment landscape, in that we sit at the sort of the convergence between public and private. So we're public funds, but we always invest alongside private investors, and we have a sort of a fairly deep network that spans both pieces of the puzzle. So as far as collaboration goes, I think we're well positioned, and we like to think that we can sort of coordinate and enable investments that might not otherwise take shape without our involvement. I think ISIF capital is pretty well matched to the climate challenge because we're long-term, strategic. We have a reasonably open appetite for risk, which I think is useful in the current environment. And we can invest at scale. So $1 billion in the context of 36 isn't much, but we always try and crowd in. And our multiplier to date is 1.6 times ISIF capital has been sort of co-invested into our investments. So, and when you start considering that a significant chunk of this is equity, and there'll be debt in a lot of the infrastructure as well, you start getting close to a number that's meaningful. So really, our role in the market is to try and catalyze and accelerate the delivery of 2030 and net zero, and partnership is really central to everything we do. So.
Brilliant. And I suppose coming last to you, Patrick, the Temporis Capital and the Aurora Fund. Can you just talk to us a bit about that and really about your perspective on collaboration, as that's pretty key to your approach in Temporis?
Thanks, Laura, and thank you, Climate Finance Week, for hosting us here today, and all the panelists coming and supporting Temporis Capital and Offshore Wind. I think the Temporis Capital perspective, to your question, Laura, of that fusion of public and private capital partnership is very interesting. We're a fund that has been up and running for 4 years, cornerstone by Paul Saunders and the ISIF team, really backing that vision, that long-term capital that Paul spoke about is what really enabled the Temporis Fund to come into being. And then other private sector investors such as AIB and others came in behind that mission, which was looking to the long term, 2030, and the shortage in supply of renewable projects that we had in the market at the time 4 years ago. The climate target at the time was, I think, 55% renewables, then jumped to 70%, and now we're at 80%. And it's all on that journey towards net zero. So what we thankfully have is a very clear policy backdrop to do what we do. And as investors, we see a shortage in supply and a very high demand for what we produce. And it's our job to go and create new things, create new renewable projects, whether that's with David in Greensource in onshore wind, whether that's with Vanessa in Inish offshore wind. We're actually technology neutral. And we're trying to bring on that new supply of renewables, which is necessary to get us to the very hard targets we've set for ourselves. And that's what Temporis Capital and the Aurora Fund was established for, that principle.
So looking at all those jigsaw pieces across the technologies that Mark was just speaking about there. So David, maybe back to you. Mark mentioned the importance of bringing the communities, bringing the public on this journey with us. You're out there, you're talking to landowners, you're talking to communities. Have you seen any shift in the discussions of, since the turn of the decade? What are you seeing and hearing out there when you talk to communities about this project that is going to be in their locality?
Yeah, thanks. It's evolved a lot, actually, and Mark alluded to as well. I think there's more of an obligation on us to be far more, obviously, open and transparent in any technology sector. And I think, unfortunately, maybe in the past that didn't happen, and then people felt there was more going on than there actually was. We're certainly seeing a change, as I mentioned in the introduction, that I think probably because, I mean, obviously being pushed on by the price that just domestic tariffs are right now, everybody's really looking at it. And to Mark's point again, in relation to rooftop solar, and certainly in the agricultural space, you know, everybody's looking at farm rooftops, and every farmer is looking at that piece the same as every home dweller. But I think that it is sort of a marriage at the moment of the price issue versus a lot of people are saying, like, we've had a few really positive interactions recently where a few landowners said to us this was more for kind of getting around a bend in the road with a turbine, and we need a piece of ground, and somebody said, well, this is our chance to do our bit. You know, that they actually said, well, we can contribute. So, you know, they weren't going to put us over a barrel for a huge check, hopefully. But the other piece, I suppose, was we have more people coming to the realization that this is the quick win, I suppose, that onshore wind has delivered, as Mark rightly said, you know, 4,500 megawatts. So if we need a number of thousand more, they are certainly achievable in the short to medium term. And I think that realization is seeping into public, because a lot more people now have a wind farm in their local county or their local community, or they know people, or they go to their cousin's house and they see them operating, and they realize they're not this big bad monster in the neighborhood. They're actually really contributing to power. And I guess the other piece that's coming is the new community contribution scheme. That's really the big one that I think that's going to be a game changer in terms of when we go out to communities and we talk about, you know, €2 a megawatt hour might mean much to some people, but when you say that's 150,000 euros every year into your local community, then you get people's attention. And then you get people asking, well, how is that administered? Well, we're going to set up a local committee. Hopefully you'll be on it with different community representatives, and you will decide, you will be empowered to decide how that money is invested into your community. So then when they're looking out, it becomes part of the community infrastructure. That's where the power comes from, and it contributes to the enhanced rural, you know, society that they're living in.
And that is a real sea change, those community benefit funds, because, you know, up until now or before RES, it was, you know, up to the particular developer what they put aside, how long it was for. Now there's very defined rules, and it is, you know, very defined in legislation about how this is going to run, and it is this 15-year income stream for a community, which is just brilliant. But great to hear you saying that it's not just the money that's changing people's minds, or that's, you know, getting the buy-in. It's also, I suppose, doing their bit, whether it's for climate or whether it's for keeping the lights on. It nearly doesn't matter. But you know, there's a lot of things converging here, aren't there?
Absolutely.
And Vanessa, then I suppose you're outside the shore. You know, you're talking to communities as well, but in this offshore context, and particularly the fishing community. What types of engagements are you having there, and is there a difference from what you're hearing from David?
I think it's somewhat similar. You know, I think when it comes to offshore wind, I think everyone will agree that, you know, one of the key stakeholders is the fishing industry.
Yes.
You know, they're offshore. They're potentially fishing in the areas that you're looking to develop your turbines. And I think the feedback that we've got, you know, we've been engaging with, I think, over 100 fishermen and fisherwomen over the last few months. I think what we're hearing is they're not against offshore wind. There is that understanding, as David says, that we need to transition. And there's an understanding that they can be part of that and want to be part of it. But I think what's there is fear. And it's a rational fear. It's protecting their livelihood and way of life for generations. So I think for us, and we have a responsibility in the industry, but also working with them, it's finding a way to have a constructive dialogue. So we can find a project that ultimately is serving the needs of the individual, the fishermen and the other stakeholders, but is also serving the needs of Ireland in terms of our energy transition. And I think things that we're looking at is, you know, what is a win-win project? You know, what would be a win offshore project for the fishing industry? We don't have the answer yet, but we're starting to, well, I think where we are right now is we're listening, we're understanding, you know, the impact of our projects. And I think from here, then we can start to have constructive dialogue of how we find solutions. I think another area, particularly around the local communities and a responsibility we have is paving the way in terms of the opportunities from offshore wind that goes beyond just the green electrons. And that's around supply chain and developing an ecosystem where there can be jobs. And I think one specific area that would be good to hear, you know, Paul's view on is around ports at the moment. There was a report released recently from Wind Energy Ireland that we supported, which concluded really right now in the Republic of Ireland, there isn't a report where we can build these offshore wind projects from. And there is quite a lot of capital investment that's required, needed to get these reports up to scratch. And we're just in that challenge space of, we need those ports tomorrow, but the ports can't currently make the business case to make that investment because they don't have clarity in terms of the pipeline of projects. So there is a little bit of a chicken and egg, and I think this is where one of these sweet spot problems where the government, industry need to come together to find a solution for this.
Yeah, brilliant. And definitely that theme of listening coming through there from both David, and reflecting what Mark said earlier about listening to and engaging with communities. And I know, Mark, you gave some great examples of kind of this new model of engagement, community engagement with EirGrid.
The real slam dunk on this, so fingers crossed, 4 weeks' time we'll sign the contract for the Celtic Interconnector, which will link Ireland to France. And this is critical, absolutely critical underpinning project for the renewables transition. So we got through on Borplanola, no oral hearing and practically no objections. I could be sitting here telling you that we're in judicial process. We made a decision that was not the best technical decision that the engineers wanted, not the best, that engineers would have ranked second or third down the list, but it was the one the community bought and accepted. And not only did they accept that alternative, because we listened to them, but then they wrote in support, 1,000 letters of support from Borplanola. That's the difference between signing a contract in 3 weeks' time and starting judicial process. And the money is very significant, but in over 40, 50, 60 years, the lifetime of the project, it becomes insignificant. The headline number is quite big, which I won't go into in terms of the additional capital costs on the project, but in the overall scheme of things and the value proposition to Ireland Inc. and to all the renewables that are trying to get onto the system, it's seismic for us. So that's walking the talk, listening and making. I remember the day in the conference room where we made the decision. A lot of money, but we said, we'll take a risk on this and hope they'll come with us, and they came with us.
It's like the
so look,
behavioural
you got to do it. You
over the technical, the way it's like understanding people.
I'm an engineer myself.
Rather than
Once
the
upon a time,
technical.
people say I'm not anymore. But the purest decision is always the purest decision for the engineers but ultimately, 1,000 people didn't like it.
And was that like about putting kind of grid
location.
under?
It was very much around
location.
Around location. And not just location, but it was also, we got an insight into the whole psychology of a community that went back to events 40 years back.
Oh, wow.
So it was as deep as that in terms of
really important.
how visceral the sense of emotion around what we were going to do. But in fairness, when we listened to them, then they backed us publicly and with Borplanola. So we're all going to have to do that. We're going to have to do that on other projects.
And did you say
putting projects underground instead of listening to what they have to say.
And did you say you're embarking on a citizen engagement project at the moment?
We're in the middle of one at the moment, the Energy Citizens Roadshow. You'll see it on LinkedIn, you'll see it on Twitter. We're in Inchicore tonight. We've been around the country with SEAI and ESP Network, and that's more just educating, informing, talking about the changes that have to happen on the system and getting people, ordinary people, to engage.
Taking the fear away. That Vanessa was talking about. Patrick, I know you had some thoughts about kind of changing the narrative and, the link to energy security in relation to that, but changing that kind of public narrative around the energy transition.
Well, it's so important what everyone's been saying, that connectivity to the community. This whole sustainable or energy transition is so different to the last 100 years of how we've interacted with energy infrastructure. It's been a world where you built a very large fossil fuel power plant, usually away from where people are, and you build one wire straight to where all the people are. It's all invisible. But there is no way to deliver the energy transition without making it visible. It has to be distributed. It needs to be in communities. It has to go where the resource is and where the demand is. So in order to cross that divide, you need to bring people on the journey. It's been in public policy since the Irish Green Paper in, I think, 2010-11, when we did our public consultations, and hearing Mark's story about how short-term cost was incurred for longer-term gain, I think is a great lesson to be learnt. We can focus too much on saving money in the short term, and it costs us more in the long term. And I think part of the reason why we have an energy security problem right now, it's got nothing to do with the war in Ukraine and the high price of gas. It's because we decided as a system or as a country to underinvest in some of the infrastructure that's there to support renewables.
Yeah.
And it's been, I suppose, in the industry, a known fact for at least a decade. And now it's coming home to roost in the mid-2020s. So we'll have to get over that hump. But ultimately, we need to invest in that resilience, a combination of resilience for renewables and engagement with citizens is, I suppose, a narrative that would be great to change. And if we can use this current emergency as the opportunity to change that narrative, I think would be very good overall for what we're trying to all achieve here at this table.
Because how many people, like until recently, how many people really think about, you know, you just turn on your light, you just, you know, are you really thinking about all the wires that are happening to make this happen, etc. So yeah, I think it really is so high on the consciousness now, it's a real opportunity. So you're talking there about investment, and we know, well, at the moment, the estimate is 36 billion that we need to invest in generation and grid by 2030. You know, all this money is going to come from somewhere, but it'll be both private and public. But Paul, I might go first to you. You know, of the I suppose, investment opportunities and the investment needs that we've been talking about here, would you be able to talk to us maybe a bit about offshore wind, and maybe just about, Vanessa referred to the ports infrastructure and the investments required there. Is that is that kind of the area that ISIF is interested in?
Absolutely. You know, so we're very keen to support the development of an offshore wind sector. And I think if you think about the long-term sort of strategic importance of offshore wind, it's huge for the country. Think about the future where we have 20, 30, 40 plus gigawatts of power offshore. We're an export economy for power. We have associated industries. So it's very well suited from an ISIF perspective for us to try and support the development of that. That's a very long-term future, and obviously charting the path from here to there is complex. But in the context of the ports piece, it's something that we're not just interested in investing in the rotating equipment and the generation equipment. We look at the storage piece as well, and all the enabling infrastructure is absolutely something that we're keen to support. So we thought the port study was excellent. We reviewed it in some detail, and I think it's I suppose from a mandate fit point of view as well. If Ireland's going to capture the real sort of economic bounty that's to be had of making this green transition and particularly delivering offshore wind at scale, then we're going to need that offshore port infrastructure ourselves in order to build the value chains and secure the jobs and the economic dividends that gives. We actually have, I should mention, a dedicated team within ISIF. So one of our themes is housing and enabling investments. Okay. And so that team have also been conducting their own port study and very busy sort of talking to all the ports around the country to figure out sort of how can we enable this. And it's a great area for ISIF to look at because we can take a long-term view. And as I said before, we probably have a little bit more risk appetite, but we do have a duty to the taxpayer to make commercial investments, so that we always need to sort of strike that balance.
And there is so much more, I suppose, enabling infrastructure and supply chain need for offshore wind as compared with, say, onshore wind. So that's kind of why you're it's that kind of different opportunity.
It is, yeah, and so we can play at all areas of the value chain. We're a very flexible investor, so we can go anywhere in the capital structure. So we can be quite innovative in how we approach investments in that space. And I think that targeting the sort of the full value chain is something that we're able to do because we have so many sort of strong partnerships that we can draw on to sort of build that out. So. Yeah.
And I suppose there's been a lot of volatility recently. How has the recent market downturns, how's that impacting climate-led investment, kind of patient investment that you do?
So clearly we're not immune from that market volatility. We've been influenced by the recent market movements, and I think we've actually been performing very well as a fund relative to the markets, but we have felt the effect of that. In terms of climate-related investment, I suppose the downturn hasn't been all bad. So if you take venture as an example, we've seen a lot of the sort of flighty capital that was seeking sort of very high, quick returns sort of back off from the market a little bit, and that creates a little bit of space for sort of the more patient, thoughtful capital that you really want to flow into, particularly to the climate space. There's been a return of some pricing discipline. I mean, particularly in the tech and life sciences side. I have to say less so probably on climate because it's just still seen as a very attractive, very hot sector.
Yeah.
And so, you know, the pricing discipline that's flowed through on the tech side is maybe hasn't fully manifested yet in climate. But
brilliant.
Yeah.
So Patrick, in terms of, you know, the role of renewables and the role of private equity, where do you see it going from here?
Well, it's a very exciting decade to be investing in this space. You know, the more we are successful in the rollout of renewables, the more there becomes a greater opportunity for different types of asset classes to be invested in that supports that renewable integration piece. Paul started to talk about the kind of, say, grid enabling or grid stabilization piece. It becomes more, I guess, more relevant, and the more relevant it becomes, the better the economic case is. So, as an investment manager raising capital in the markets, that creates great new opportunity for private equity managers like us to put that capital to work, to identify the opportunities emerging in the Irish energy ecosystem and start investing in those new asset classes. So, 3 years ago, there were no grid-scale batteries on the Irish grid.
Yeah.
Now there are, Mark, you probably have the number off the top of your head, 400 or 500 megawatts, something of that nature.
But it's there.
It's there. Yeah. That wasn't there before.
I should probably jump in and say we were a cornerstone investor in Gore Street Energy Storage, who are now one of the biggest providers of energy storage assets on the grid. So.
Yeah. So as Vanessa's offshore wind farms actually come to fruition, and we have gigawatts of new renewables at sea, that won't work unless we have things like the Celtic interconnector to France and plenty other assets coming down the road. So we see it as a great opportunity for private capital enabled by the public sector to help deliver the transition.
And in addition to kind of the battery storage area, are there other areas that you're looking at?
Well, I mean, there's synchronous condensers.
Yep.
There's different bits of equipment that you can use. But I suppose, Laura, it's always trying to replace what we've had historically, right? So we want to rely less on coal-fired power station in Moneypoint. We want to rely less on gas-fired turbines. But they always provided more than just megawatt hours, right? They provided stability, voltage regulation, and they had built-in storage. You could have a field of coal next to your power plant or a gas network giving you that resilience. Renewables doesn't have that benefit, of course. So we need to replicate that resilience, and those types of assets that allow us to turn off our fossil fuel power stations is what's necessary. So a whole variety of assets. And it's not just infrastructure, it's actually new business models too, right? We have to change how we use energy. Nobody is going to want to start worrying about when they have the light switch on or off, unless it's your own house and you're running around turning off the light switches, as I do frequently all evening. But generally speaking, we don't want to be aware of how we get our energy. So we will rely on data, new business models, and the automation factor. We've seen that in the Googles and the Facebooks of this world. What have they done to the advertising sector? That needs to happen to the energy sector next. And so that integration between how the consumer behaves and infrastructure is huge space of opportunity. So
by really kind of knowing renewables, really understanding the market, you can see the differences between kind of what we had and the gaps then in terms of where, what we will need to add to the renewables to ensure that everything remains stable, so you can kind of spot the investment opportunities that way.
Well, it's like Paul said, in the VC space, it's, flighty capital is leaving. For those investors who really understand the sectors they operate in, Temporis Capital sees a great opportunity to pivot from pure infrastructure to VC PE, backing the kind of companies that are going to help leverage that efficient use of sustainable infrastructure. So that's what really drives carbon out of the system. And those businesses need to be supported to grow, which I know is something that we all think about here in the panel.
Brilliant. And growing businesses, I suppose, David, that's you. And, can you give us a feel? So you obviously have, received private equity investment. How has that allowed you to scale your business? You spoke about it a bit at the start. What is that, I suppose, what difference has that made from your perspective in terms of your activities as a rural community-based business?
Yeah, Laura, I guess it's been transformative really, because I mean, for a small, slow-growing organic Irish business to evolve like that, really we needed our early stage projects to come out of the ground, have some revenues from those to first of all prove that we could do it, secondly have that equity release for the next project and the next project. And if you grow organically like that, it can take a long time. So this allowed us to take a step change, and like I said, to utilize the really good skill set that we had homegrown and the great team that we'd put together to say, well, actually we can do this. Nothing against other utility companies coming into the space, but personally, obviously, I'm a great advocate for Irish homegrown talent to be able to be creating those jobs in Ireland for Irish people and bring in the technology by all means. But I mean, that's really where it's shifted for us. And I do think, just to touch on one point Mark made earlier, I do think that while government policy has been, it's very hard to fault it, it's been excellent in many ways, it's the actions out of it and the implementation gap of it sometimes, and particularly around, I think, like on Mohr Pleanála, we deal with on Mohr Pleanála quite a lot in strategic infrastructure development. I'm sure Mark has many times far more experience than I have, but we've had some really good experiences with very dedicated staff there who, really went the extra mile to try and help us to put in the best application possible and pointing out pitfalls and make sure we have everything covered off. But then you feel the strain they're under. You realise they have another meeting they're going on to straight after yours and another. And you think that's really one of the critical junctures, that they need more support. And I know there are talks of things in the pipeline there, and I really hope that's going to happen. Because I think it's one of the big impediments to us is that the faster we can get a project through the system, and hopefully we'll get a positive outcome, but even if we're not going to get a positive outcome, the sooner we know and we're not deploying more resources on that, be it the human resource or capital, the better. And that's just one of the areas. And I suppose the second one, that just to add to that, is, which I'm struck by and it keeps coming into my head as I sit here, I was at another sustainability forum recently, and the speaker got up and he said a very profound statement. You've often heard it all before, I'm sure, that the best time to plant a tree was 100 years ago, but the second best time is now. And that's the piece that really resonates with me, that we're all kind of preaching to the converted here. We're all saying the same thing, but it's the doers, it's the action makers that we need. And in every individual sector, as has been pointed out by Paul and Patrick, that from the ports right through the whole supply chain, that we need the action, and we need actors there to carry those out. But it is difficult, though, when you see really good people in state companies that are doing their best to support private industry, but you realise they're under a huge strain. And we really need to support that. Yeah,
and that really reflects what I think Vanessa said at the outset about the Offshore unit and the need for more resources. I think we hear that right across the public sector, and there's certainly resource needs in the private as well. Vanessa, offshore wind projects are, such as your ones, they're competing on an international stage for investment, and obviously we've had a few big names exiting recently. What are you seeing in terms of, the ability of Ireland Inc. to attract investment to our Irish offshore wind projects when compared to others? Yeah,
I suppose, there has been some exits, and that is disappointing, because we're all working really hard to build a sector, and we want to have the confidence of the international investors, because that will be required for the ultimate capital that's required to build these projects. The one word that will probably resonate with everyone is certainty. So it's closing that implementation gap. And I think probably the likes of ourselves, Inish Offshore Wind, with the backing of Temporis and ISIF, in one way, companies like ourselves are well placed to navigate that uncertainty and risk in the early phase of development. So we can, forge the path. We're on the ground here in Ireland. We're working closely with the government. We're trying to build that relationship with the government, get that mutual understanding to basically forge that path to be able to progress these projects. So I think that, just coming back to the overall theme of the discussion, private equity and government, we've got the backing of ISIF. It is important to have that, so then we can, within years, it might not be now, some international investors will be like, okay, it's more certain in the UK, I'll invest there. Yeah. But certainly there's a lot of capital for these projects, will continue to be capital. So over the next few years, I think that's our job, to just get certainty, reduce the risk, and then the capital will come back in. So, brilliant. Optimistic. And Mark, I know, when we were preparing for this, one of your comments was
capital is not the problem from a grid rollout perspective. That's not one of your issues. Do you want to give us a bit more of a feel for what are the bottlenecks that you're seeing? What are the things? I know you spoke about these at the outset as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that many of them have been alluded to. I mean, if you look right across the ecosystem, we have the technology in the main, and what we don't have is coming. We have very high quality developers in the offshore solar, and we've world-class players.
Yeah.
With great capabilities, etc. But we've got embedded bottlenecks in the system. If we're to be we should be in this decade absolutely just in delivery mode. But we're not, unfortunately, because a lot of things have come late, be it the planning legislation for offshore, be it the regulatory system not moving fast enough and not responding to how fast the market and developers can move, and be it the crunch that has manifested in onboard Planola. I mean, what has happened in onboard Planola in the last year is tragic in many respects. It seems to have somewhat imploded in terms of some of the issues that have risen. So it is a major bottleneck, clearly, for getting projects that we have a fantastic pipeline, but getting them through the pipeline so that we can be in delivery mode. So planning and regulatory are two recurring areas that are just grinding us to a halt. So there's the system is moving at different speeds.
And is it just chipping away at those, or how are we going to overcome those issues?
I think, at the risk of being too controversial, I think fundamental reform is probably needed in both domains, in my view.
Yeah. Planning and reg.
I mean, the stage on board Planola we're in today, it doesn't look like it's a small fix. It looks like it's a fairly significant fix. And secondly, I mean, just really injecting real speed of both decision-making and quality of decision-making into the regulatory environment is vital for us to deliver and for other elements of the system to deliver. And I think that's a bit more in the reform than it is in the tweaking around the edges.
And just to jump in there, the quantum of investment that we're talking about from an offshore wind perspective, you're talking kind of minimal 3 billion for these projects. Average judicial review times, the last time I was looking, is sort of 2 to 2.5 years. That you can't square that circle in terms of the level of certainty that required for an investment like that. So I think that fundamental reform is really important.
And Laura, I'll just say you referenced exits from the market recently as well. I think we have to acknowledge we're competing for these large multinational players to come in and help deliver these projects, right? So they're looking at global portfolios of development opportunities, and Ireland has to be competitive for them to stay
And that is around the certainty, it's around the planning, it's around sorting out some of these issues. So I suppose looking to net zero and beyond, thinking about the future, maybe just a final question to each of you. Paul, I'll go to you first. How should we think about balancing that near-term challenge of delivering the infrastructure we need by 2030 with really all the kind of innovation now we need to do to get to net zero and beyond?
Yeah, okay. So this is something we spend, as you know, a lot of time thinking about. And I think, I agree with Mark. It has to be all about delivery, right? We just need to get out there and do it. And we invest alongside Generation Investment Management in a few areas. That's Al Gore, David Blood's group. And they've spoken to us a number of times about this concept of the time value of carbon, that a ton out today is worth way more than a ton out in 5 years' time because you just end up on a different trajectory. So I think it's all about delivery. And so I think the bulk of our capital will be deployed into sustainable infrastructure that supports delivery of the 2030 targets. What we can bring that's different, though, is we can take a very long-term view and say, post-2030, even if and when we meet those targets, we're still only halfway there. So what options can we develop in the next number of years that deliver the new tech, new business models that the rest of the economy is going to need? So we're combining that sort of sustainable infrastructure pillar with something that looks a lot more venture-like in nature, where we're investing and working with top quality Irish and international investment managers, getting them active in the Irish market, building that investment ecosystem so that we can strike the balance.
And you mentioned something like similar to what you've kind of done, or what has been done in Ireland in the life sciences space. Really kind of developing that platform for Ireland in climate tech, climate innovation.
Exactly, and it takes a bit of time, and but it sort of links then all the way back to your first point around collaboration, right? That you need this sort of ecosystem of players in the market, and it's not all about finance. It's about delivery. It's about entrepreneurs. It's about developers. But you need all that to take shape, and it does take a little bit of time. But we spend a lot of time thinking about that.
Brilliant,
Yeah.
David. Last point from you. What's your perspective on getting to 2030 and then beyond? What do you think we can do from a national perspective?
Yeah, I mean, look, we have a huge amount of work to do, as Mar said at the start. I mean, there's so much to do in this space. We have a lot of, I guess, willing people to do that. The issue is, I guess, we need to keep imagining the collaboration piece, which is the theme of today as well. And I think while we look at maybe offshore, that there's a lot of, say, projects we and other developers are looking at within the vicinity of an offshore potential landing point for a connection for grid. So that, as we evolve through the good work in shaping now and into the future, that's going to be live and dynamic. That will consider, well, there's consented onshore projects here within 30 kilometers of an offshore consented project, and we're going to look at hybrid solutions to those. I think we need to be open to more collaboration and more dynamic arrangements like that to deliver. But I mean, obviously in the development space, you have to be an eternal optimist. I mean, you wouldn't get out of bed in the morning if you weren't. It's always glass half full. And I think so from that point of view, and again, it's back to Patrick's point, I mean, it's a very exciting time to be in this business. Like I remember in the late 90s, starting out on this, and there was a small handful of people in the Irish wind industry back then. And some of them are still around today, but a lot of them have moved on and moved sideways in other places. But I guess, it's interesting to see all the international interest, and it is a very competitive market from a development perspective out there now. And that's only a good thing, because it raises the bar on everybody. We all have to achieve better things. And I think it's back to the same piece. We keep talking about it, and this isn't in a greenwashing or community washing way, but that is the game changer, that the more communities that buy into seeing actually development as part of the solution for Ireland. Yeah. And we benefit, we all benefit, future generations benefit. I think that penny is starting to drop, and if there's good coming out of the bad things happening in the world now, people are being challenged in the way they weren't challenged before, to look at the Ireland of the next decade, the Ireland of the next 20, 30 years to 2050. And they are taking a generational view. So we are at that kind of convergence point there, I think, that those things are going to bring good things out of them. Yeah. And it's a great time to be around in the business.
The Ireland for our kids, it's starting to become just about the next generation.
Exactly.
Patrick, one of the questions for you is, I suppose, at the moment there's this push back towards fossil fuels because of the security crisis, because of what's going on in the Ukraine. How do we marry that with meeting our 2030 targets and with the journey we need to go on? How's this all going to play out?
Well, I think in the very, very short term, there are not many options, right? Which is, we must keep the lights on. So that will be fossil fuel driven. But I think there's a real opportunity, I said it before, changing that narrative. Yeah. I think David mentioned it there. If you meet anyone on the street and you ask them, do you support climate change and protecting climate? Most people will say, of course I do. But that connectivity between that thought process and how do I deliver something that's helpful, I don't think has been there historically. And perhaps this focus energy is now front page news with the security is an opportunity to change that dialogue, bring the community. So I would say that my view would be the next 10 years, it's all about the grid, actually. Yeah. Yeah. Temporis is heavily invested in renewables. That core sustainable infrastructure is the bedrock that we have the opportunity. But as it's successful, we're at 40% renewables today on average, which means that at times it's 70, 80% renewable. How do we build a grid that facilitates a very efficient use of renewables? Most of our grid infrastructure, Mark, was built in the 1980s, correct me if I'm wrong, right? And yes, EirGrid have been doing great projects and shaping is there to do many more, but we need a grid infrastructure and a way to operate that grid very, very different to the way it was in the past. Yeah. So, in a way, I would imagine it's an expansion of EirGrid's role, like an expansion of that almost scope of problem they're trying to solve, which can really drive change in how it is. So I agree with there's a certain amount of system change required to get us there. Yeah. And perhaps now is the time to do that.
Great. And so, Mark, to you, really, where...
Challenge accepted. No, Patrick's right. I mean, the reason we're trying to get people behind shaping is we're bedeviled in Ireland between you produce a plan And then somebody says, well, we won't do that. Let's wait till we have a better one. Shaping is a damn good plan. Get behind it, and we're committed to delivering it. There's 320 projects in it. We are at full steam ahead now to drive out the front end of these projects. And we're making the brave decision to put lines underground, to de-risk them, to get them done faster, and to get them to the point where you've got the capacity to connect your project. So I accept Patrick's thesis is correct. The grid is critical. It's central to the whole thing, as is interconnection. And to David's very, very important point, get behind shaping, but it's not the 10 commandments, right? It has to be flexible. We have to look at it regularly, and we've committed that in public, and we have to be capable of adapting it. If a big project like an offshore project doesn't show up, there has to be a plan B, and we are committed to that. So I think we're very aligned. That's an example of collaboration. Yeah. We're accepting what we're hearing from David and others in shaping. Don't make it gospel such that you're not going to change it. We have to adapt. The world is never going to be. But we need people getting behind the principles and the major projects that are in it. And my last comment would be to stop mixing up time horizons. 2030 is about delivering proven technology. Yep. And the problem with some of the conversations is they get mixed up between 2030 and beyond. And then people start talking about hydrogen, then people start separate the two domains, have separate people working on the two, fix the delivery roadblocks in 2030, have a focused narrative only on delivery in 2030, and have other people talking about the future beyond 2030. Mix the two together, nobody does anything. And we need to bring nuclear into the conversation. A shot for this one. Okay. But we need, in looking at 2030 to 2050, we have to have an honest conversation as to whether nuclear is a relevant technology for Ireland. We need to at least have an honest conversation. Look at the state of affairs globally, look at the SMRs, etc. Because a lot of people are talking about hydrogen, including a lot of people who know nothing about it. We can't just bet on something that isn't proven at a commercial scale.
Hey, throwing that
let's
in
have
just
an honest
at the last
conversation
minute there, Mark.
In the second domain.
So 2 minutes left for Vanessa to just, I suppose you did a great piece in the Irish Times there recently, kind of a blueprint for the vision for the future. Do you want to just give us a minute on that one?
Well, what I'd like to say in a minute is that I think we all agree that this is a golden opportunity, and I hope everyone who's listening at home or in the office that this is really an exciting time for Ireland. We know it's challenging, and I think for me, from a lot of what we've said, one of the fundamental things that I think is key to this is building trust across all of Irish society so that we can collaborate. We know it takes time, so I think we are in a hurry, but you also need to take the time that's required to solve these challenging systemic wicked problems that we have in terms of this transition. So I think I'd actually like to leave everyone with a metaphor. It comes from Jim Collins' book, Good to Great. It's a flywheel metaphor. So I want you to picture a huge, heavy flywheel, a massive metal disc mounted horizontally on an axis. It's big, it's heavy, it's initially really hard to get it going, lots of work, lots of people, but gradually you do get it going, you get it moving, it starts to get its own velocity, and we don't need much energy to keep it going. So that analogy for me is quite useful when we think about the Irish system and what we're trying to do in terms of developing a new system for net zero. It reminds me of the flywheel in that we're at the early stage of a new industry, lots of potential, it's taking a lot of energy, it's very difficult, lots of inertia in the system, but we've got to get going. We've got to get that system going, and we've got to get that fly moving. And I'm going to be a little bit cheesy at the end and say, the grease in that flywheel is trust. So I think, we at ANH, and I think everyone here is committed to it. So let's get that flywheel moving.
Go for it. Brilliant. Well, listen, I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. Thanks so much to all the panelists here today. My thanks to Inish Offshore and Temporis Capital for putting on the event. There is lots more to come in the final 2 days of Climate Finance Week. As we mentioned before, all organised by Sustainable Finance Ireland in association with the Department of Finance. Thank you so much to Mark Foley, Group CEO of EirGrid, Paul Saunders from the ISIF, Vanessa O'Connell of Inish Offshore Wind, David McDonnell of Greensource, and Patrick Mohr of Temporis Capital. And thanks to you all for tuning in online. I hope you enjoyed the conversation and have a good evening.